In one of our previous lists, we referred to modern-day Konami like this.
They are the video game equivalent of the funky liquid in the bottom of your bin that never seems to dry. Bin juice.
Harsh? Perhaps. But hey, it was Ben who said it, not me, so I'm off the hook. Either way though, I think it is fair to say that Konami represents one of gaming's most significant falls from grace. From groundbreaking developer during the first console generations to cinematic saviour of early disc-based games, the company was poised to remain video game royalty. Today, however, they are roughly equivalent to that mouldy pot of half-eaten soft cheese you left rotting in the back of the fridge that you're too afraid to move in case the smell somehow kills you. Harsh? Perhaps, and I said it this time, so I'm really in trouble now. The company was among the best and most influential developers for decades, which means they have indeed left a legacy, however dedicated they may be right now to squandering it. As with the Ubisoft list we did in a similar vein, the entries here aren't necessarily things that were invented by Konami. Rather, we are including them because the company popularized these ideas and brought them to the mainstream, where everyone else was all too keen to copy them. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 ideas everyone copied from Konami video games. Number 10. The Konami Code, Gradius. Say it with me now. Up, up, down, down, left, right, BA. First used back in the 1986 home port of the arcade game Gradius, which before the comments go wild is actually pronounced Gradius and not Gradius according to the Japanese title, the Konami code was included by accident. As the story goes, one of the developers, Kazuhisa Hashimoto, was struggling to progress through the game during testing. To make things easier, he programmed a quick cheat code that would instantly give him a full set of power-ups. The code was forgotten until very late in development, and the team decided to leave it in place out of fear that removing it might create new bugs so close to release. Since then, the code has become a staple of Konami games, with Contra being its most famous incarnation. In fact, it's sometimes referred to as the Contra code, due to how much of a necessity it is for many players. You can easily credit the Konami code with the rise of cheat codes in the following years. The concept stuck around, going from being an important way for developers to test their games, to allowing kids to turn Tony Hawk into a teensy little flip tricker. It truly was a magical time. But even if you want to argue that the Konami code itself was not responsible for popularizing cheat codes in later games, this still definitely deserves a place in this list, given that many games use the actual Konami code itself, or an equivalent for the respective console's controller, rather than their own unique codes. It's obviously done to pay tribute to Konami in Contra rather as an act of plagiarism, but whichever way you look at it, this cheat code is definitely something that many people copied from Konami video games. Number 9. The Metroidvania genre, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. The reason this entry isn't higher is a simple one. Of the portmanteau that is Metroidvania, the Metroid part is far more influential than Vania, but there is a reason the subgenre isn't just called a Metroid-like. Back in 1997, the third dimension was all the rage, and I still quite like it to be honest. All of the major releases were either fully or partially 3D. However, there was one particular Konami title that broke the mold by, well, returning the mold to a comfy primordial state. The decision to make Castlevania Symphony of the Night a 2D game in a post-Super Mario 64 world was a brave one, but it paid off. Not only is Symphony of the Night usually regarded as the best entry in the series, it was also one of the best releases of 1997 full stop. Quite a feat considering the competition. Most importantly though, Symphony of the Night showed that 2D was still a viable option, that you didn't have to release a big budget 3D colossus to get attention. It's a mindset that in years to come would give a platform to both indie games and the concept of Metroidvanias as a whole. It is, however, time to give the genre a new name, as most Metroidvanias don't really look like Metroid or Castlevania anymore. I suppose Axiom Verge and Bloodstained Ritual of the Night do, but those games literally made a concerted effort to look like their forefathers, proving that this is the exception rather than the norm. Number 8. Instrument-based rhythm games, Guitar Freaks and Drum Mania. It will be understandable to think that Guitar Hero began the instrument as a controller craze of 2005. Understandable, but wrong. Apologise immediately, because Konami were actually the ones who spawned the idea, creating both Guitar Freaks and Drum Mania back in 1999. They were exactly as you are probably imagining. Players used dedicated controllers designed to resemble the instruments and played along to the on-screen commands. The thing is, when Guitar Freaks and Drum Mania finally hit the console market, they weren't quite the revelation that Guitar Hero would go on to be. While these titles may have been hits in the arcades of the East, Konami's dalliances with rhythm games didn't set the whole world on fire. Well, at least not in the way they did a year prior, but oh boy, we will get to that. Both Rock Band and Guitar Hero would go on to garner critical acclaim and make enough net profit to make Activision weak at the knees, so it's a shame that Konami's inspirational first crack at the idea has been mostly forgotten. Number 7. Social Stats and the Modern Dating Sim, Tokimeki Memorial. I'm going to be honest, I've never played Tokimeki Memorial, I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Obscure Japan-only dating sims from the 90s aren't exactly our forte on this channel. We apologise if we somehow gave you that impression. Still, we are a channel of the people, after all, so let's do this. Tokimeki Memorial, I think, is likely the most influential dating sim of all time, even if it wasn't technically the first. It was predated by the likes of the even harder to pronounce Doki Yusei a couple of years prior. But as we said in the intro, it's not always about who comes first. Dating sims in general are a predominantly Japanese genre. Tokimeki Memorial was actually polled as Japan's 23rd favourite video game of all time by Famitsu magazine back in 2006, which is certainly a bit of information we all now know. The most important mechanic that the Konami title pioneered was the use of improvable social stats, which are basically skill points from an RPG, but centering on social attributes. You'll find similar mechanics in major series such as Persona today. If only life were as easy as putting a few experience points into charisma. We'd all be happy then. No, who am I kidding? I just spend all of my time grinding mini-games for trophies. Number 6. Cover systems, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty. The idea of hiding from enemy fire or sight had been around for many years before Metal Gear Solid 2. I mean, for starters, you could get up against the wall in Metal Gear Solid 1. But if you want to get really abstract, it's pretty much the entire premise of Space Invaders, after all. And if you don't want to get abstract, then, I don't know, Time Crisis? However, one thing that was missing to justify calling it a system in the first place was reciprocation. As in, the AI had to be able to do the same thing in return. That's where Metal Gear Solid 2 came in. Yes, it took all the way until 2001 for AI to know to hide from gunfire, as opposed to just barreling in face first and trying to catch it all in their teeth. For the first time, they could intelligently duck behind cover before leaning out to take a pop at you, or stay in the shadows and call for backup. While this new concept wasn't central to the Metal Gear Solid 2 experience, the idea did go on to become a genre all of its own. The third-person shooter Kill Switch expanded upon the feature years later, and made a cover system its core premise, followed of course by the likes of Gears of War, Uncharted, and pretty much every tactical shooter going forwards. So, the trope of walking into an open area full of Wilson high walls and knowing there's about to be a shootout here was actually the fault of Konami and Hideo Kojima. Thanks for that, buddy. Number 5. Simultaneous co-op, Contra. While simultaneous cooperative play had been in arcades for a while by the late 80s, for home consoles it was a rather rare inclusion. Competitive play and alternating co-op was more commonplace, take Super Mario Bros. For example, but being on screen together and working with one another was a different case entirely. The likes of Bubble Bobble and Ikari Warriors did exist on the NES before Contra, but it was Konami's run-and-gun shooter that made everyone pay attention. Contra, or Probotector if you want to get European about this, even though nobody here really calls it that anymore because that name is a relic of a bygone era of censorship in a fledgling industry, proved that simultaneous co-op was a financially viable option moving forward. Even though you could play solo if you wanted, the idea of going through the trying experience with a friend or relative was its most appealing feature. You could say that simultaneous co-op is a byproduct of the arcade formula. As arcade games were made ridiculously difficult so they could get more money out of you, having a friend join you in the struggle would make it both easier and more bearable. In fact, you could almost say the modern version of this is playing co-op in a live service game to stave off the tedium of the constant grind. But whichever camp you're in, it's a bit of a stretch to blame either Contra or arcade gaming for Marvel's Avengers, but the point still stands. Number 4. Dance games. Dance Dance Revolution. The history of rhythm games is steeped in the name Konami. Guitar Freaks and Drum Mania helped define their own musical subgenre, and you can put the dancing game craze down to Konami as well. While the rhythm game as a whole is likely more defined by the release of Parappa the Rapper, it was a couple of years later, when Konami created Dance Dance Revolution, that things really took off. And although you can't even put dance mat technology down to Konami's own creation, given that Nintendo released the Power Pad and Dance Aerobics a whole decade earlier, it was Dance Dance Revolution which popularised the whole thing. From Konami's influence, you had the likes of the Just Dance series, a slew of Kinect and Wii titles, and even VR rhythm games such as Beat Saber. Man, remember when Konami were making games everybody loved? Feels like a different world altogether now. Number 3. The modern stealth game, Metal Gear Solid. The concept of a stealth game may have begun with 1981's Castle Wolfenstein, but it was Metal Gear Solid that cemented our modern concept of the genre, and its influence is seen in just about every stealth game since. We've already mentioned Metal Gear Solid 2's impact on a completely different kind of game with its cover system, so if the MGS series did that for a whole other genre entirely, imagine the impact it had within its own genre. Metal Gear Solid took the ideas of tactical espionage from its forebearers and expanded upon them exponentially. These new foundations would lay the groundwork for future franchises such as Hitman and especially Splinter Cell, which was intended by Ubisoft to be the Metal Gear Solid 2 killer, as it happens. From mobile camouflage and body concealment to multiple enemy alert modes and radar vision cones, wherever you look in a stealth genre, you'll see plenty of this series' influences. And as surprising as it may be, we aren't yet finished with Metal Gear Solid in this list. But just before we get to that, number 2, psychological horror, Silent Hill. Being first to do something isn't important. In fact, I think more than half the entries in this list are examples of things that Konami popularised despite not doing first. In 1996, Resident Evil was released. It coined the term survival horror, taking some of the foundations laid down by the likes of Alone in the Dark, adding its own B-movie charm, and subsequently setting the tone for the entire genre going forward. Even putting the survival aspects aside, Resident Evil walked into the horror genre and told everyone who was doing campy stuff to shut the hell up, especially you, Night Trap, because there was a new king in town. This was how things were going to be done going forward. That is, until Silent Hill. Psychological horror quickly swept the campy stuff off the table after Team Silent's seminal masterpiece hit shelves. No longer was horror this.
Wow, what a mansion!
Now things were getting serious. While some may cite phantasmagoria when it comes to the root of psychological horror in video games, it was undoubtedly Silent Hill that made the biggest impact on future titles. After Silent Hill, games focused on playing to the fear rather than trying to be the fear. Suddenly, it was all about exploring deep-seated phobias rather than lots of things yelling boo at you. There was still very much a place for Resident Evil in their own campy B-movie corner, but on the other side of the room, Silent Hill was lying us all down on a couch and asking us all why we were still having nightmares about that thing that happened in the summer holidays when we were 7 years old. Do you remember all the blood? How they screamed? And it worked, with the first 3 games in the series to this day being among the best and most influential in the psychological horror subgenre, and perhaps even in the horror genre as a whole. Subtlety is the key to spookums. I think it was Gandhi who said that. And number 1, cinematic storytelling. Before Metal Gear Solid, a game's story and gameplay were distinct and separate. Either the story was the central focus, as with FMV games and text adventures, or more commonly, the gameplay took centre stage and plot was lazily tacked onto the side, relegated at best to cutscenes or at worst to the first page of the manual. But then Metal Gear Solid came along and everything changed. There's a reason it's often touted as a cinematic experience. No longer did gaming have to exist in the shadow of film when it came to storytelling. Now games had the ability to get their narratives across in just as impactful a way, sometimes even more so. By using the techniques and the language of cinema, Kojima's influential title took games to the next level of interactive storytelling. You could even argue that this was the turning point between modern and retro gaming. And let's face it, MGS is absolutely influential enough to claim to represent that line. The cinematic experience is central to the games industry today. From the likes of The Last of Us Part 2 to Ghosts of Tsushima, meshing gameplay with believable and cinematic narratives is all down to Metal Gear Solid's success. I wonder why Konami doesn't make those games anymore. Only joking, we all know exactly why.